2, and they're anticipating a very sharp uptick in quarters 3 and 4. And then the dotted red line just says, and what would happen if we had 4% growth per annum after that? And to put that into context, the grey line shows what happened with equivalent time lag after the global financial crisis. So this is rather a curious picture. On the OBR projections, you can see that we're experiencing a far worse recession than the one that followed the global financial crisis, but that they're expecting a much more rapid bounce back. Well, obvious question is that what's really going to happen? And the truthful answer is that nobody knows, not even roughly, because so much depends on policy decisions. So if we had policy set by a committed market fundamentalist like Jacob Rees-Mogg, then we will see a no-deal Brexit at the end of the year, which the government's own estimates say would be very damaging to the economy. And that would be followed by savage cuts to public spending. And so that might produce a profile which looks something like the bottom of that shaded grey area. On the other hand, if we had a leader like Franklin D. Roosevelt or Clement Attlee in charge of policy, then we'd be expecting some form of New Deal with much greater support both for businesses and for the population. And that might produce a profile rather like the top of the grey area. The US New Deal that Roosevelt introduced saw enormous public investment programs and job creation schemes. And that's what's turned around and started to end the Great Depression. In the UK, after the Second World War, Clement Attlee's government decided to invest to follow the blueprint of the Beveridge Report. And so they built the NHS and they constructed the welfare state. And in both cases, the results were very good for the economy overall, but specifically, they were far, far better than had been the case before for the typical member of society. So on the face of it, it looks like a no-brainer. Why don't we just choose that sort of no-deal approach? Why don't we go for the top of the grey area rather than the bottom? Well, the obvious question is, what would happen to the debt? And we're starting to hear a lot of noise about the debt. So this is a chart. Most of the data there come from the Bank of England, which has a data set which includes 300 years of economic history. In fact, more for some data, but for debt, you can get 300 years of debt. And the very last bit comes from the Office of Budget Responsibility again. And they're saying that actually now debt to GDP in this country is round about 100%. Is that a problem? There are lots of people telling us that it is a problem, that it's a ruinous level and that we need to prepare now for another round of austerity. But actually, that's not what the rest of the data show. 100% is not staggeringly high by historical in historical terms, and nor is it in terms of international comparison. It's not even rather high. In fact, it's almost exactly the average level of debt that we've had for the last 300 years. So there is, in fact, no factual basis for that debt hysteria. And in fact, even if the debt went a long way above 100%, there'd still be no reason for hysteria. If you look at around 1820 there, that's about the time when the Industrial Revolution really took off. And at that point, debt to GDP was over 200%. And immediately before the golden age of capitalism, which is the post-war period, 1945 up to 1980, debt to GDP was over 250%. But those two were our two most successful periods in our economic history. So very high levels of debt, well above 100%, are demonstrably not an obstacle to growth. And in fact, it's that growth itself that reduces the rate of debt to GDP. So I think we will continue to hear a lot of noise about ruinous levels of debt and the supposed need to balance the books. There's been a bit of that in the last week, in fact. Almost all of that's going to come from politicians and journalists, and hardly any of it is going to come from serious economists in reputable universities. And I think now you can see the reason. So we actually have a choice between a world of austerity or that New Deal style world. And what does that choice actually mean for people? Well, let's just think about the year 2050. What could happen to median wages by then? Of course, the answer is it depends which trends we follow. So at the moment, or at the end of last year, the median earner was taking home just under £25,000 a year. What would that figure be in 2050? Well, if we were to follow the pre-2010 trends, then it would be a little under 35,000. At the other end of the spectrum, if we were to follow the coronavirus with a no-deal Brexit and semi-permanent austerity, we might be looking at a number much closer to 16,000. There's a dramatic difference. In the first case, the average person would have a far easier life than today. It wouldn't be luxurious, but it would be far easier than today. In the second case, most people would be living in poverty, or at least pretty close to today's poverty line, which is that red line across the graph here. So the UK would have become a little bit like South Africa, a small number of very, very wealthy people who live surrounded by intense security to protect them from the impoverished masses. And that process, which is unfortunately the track that we are on today, is what the 99% organization calls mass impoverishment. And that's what we were set up to prevent. And even worse than that, the crises that we face right now are not just COVID-19 and Brexit and mass impoverishment. We also face a climate emergency. And once we factor those trends in as well, the choice looks even more stark. So you can see earnings on the x-axis here and cumulative CO2 emissions on the y-axis. If we were just to continue in the direction that we've been going for the last 10 years, we would see earnings continue to decline, as we've said, but we would also see cumulative CO2 emissions increasing far too fast, far too far into the danger area. So that means we would neither succeed in tackling mass impoverishment nor in dealing with climate change. And because those two factors will probably interact with each other, the endpoint is probably even worse than the diagram suggests. On the other hand, if we were to invest to build a greener, more prosperous, fairer society, we could end up in a very different place. You can see on the right there, we could dramatically reduce the rate of CO2 equivalent emissions, and at the same time, we could produce a far, far better median earnings picture. So rather than our children, as at present, being the first generation that actually expects to be poorer than its parents, young people today should be able to expect to be substantially better off in a much greener world. We've seen some indications that that's a choice that we face. We haven't seen evidence yet, but we've seen some indications. So why don't we simply choose no mass impoverishment, no environmental degradation, lower inequality, and a constructive role for everyone in society? In other words, why don't we choose a positive future for our children? So I'm going to stop speaking now so that we can take some questions. And then after the break, we'll come back to the very obvious question of how on earth can we make that happen?
Thank you, Mark. I might jump in with a question for you because there's not many questions in the question box. So what you're saying with those debt sides, are you saying there's no limit on how much money government can spend and borrow?
Well, there's actually no limit as to how much government can spend, because government can also create money. So if you think about what the Bank of England has done since the global financial crisis, it has created, via quantitative easing, it's created almost $750 billion of quantitative easing, of money being created. So there is in reality no shortage of money. You don't even need to borrow it. What there is a shortage of is productive capacity. So the government can always create demand if there is supply there. What it can't do is to create supply just like that if there isn't supply. So one of the really important things in handling this recession now is to protect supply. If we let lots and lots of businesses go to the wall, go bankrupt because they're currently unprofitable, and there's a real risk of that, according to what Rishi Sunak said last week, we could massively reduce supply. And once it's reduced, it's much, much harder to recreate it. You can't create that supply by either printing money or borrowing money by spending money. What you can do, though, is if you've protected it, which needs some money, you can then create the demand in future to make sure that that supply is fully utilized and to make sure that the economy grows healthily. Does that answer your question, Jack?
Yes, it does. I think probably we're waiting on a few more questions, but it might be an idea. People are maybe a little bit shy, so we'll probably have a few more. I can think of a few more questions as it goes along. So if you want to go along to the next section, Mark,
okay,
and then we have a few more questions at the end. Would that be okay?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So we saw that there's a range of futures open, and we saw that at one end of that range there's a rather attractive future. So as I said, the question is really, how on earth can we do that? What do we have to do to build that attractive future? And of course, the answer is it's all to do with the economy. And unfortunately, the economy is a complex system. But to make it simpler, we can think of it as being a little bit like a pie. Sorry, I can too fast now. So if we think of it that way, the size of the pie represents the value of the goods and services that the economy can produce, does produce, which are available to be consumed and distributed amongst the population. And the size of each slice represents what each person actually gets. So at the moment, we've got three problems with that pie. First of all, for the last 10 years, the pie has hardly grown at all. Secondly, when it does grow, some of that growth is bad for the environment. And thirdly, most people's slices are smaller now than they were in 2007. So how are we going to fix that? It does sound quite difficult. But in principle, actually, the answer is simple. Firstly, we need to make sure that when we do grow the pie, the growth isn't harmful. And secondly, we need to grow it faster and share it more fairly. If we could do those two things, then we would be able to produce that attractive future that we talked about in the first part. So let's start by looking at the issue of good growth and bad growth. You can think of all economic activities, everything we do, as being split into three buckets. The good bucket, which contains all those activities that don't harm the environment at all. So, for example, planting trees, in fact, is very good for the environment. It's one of the best ways, in fact, one of the most reliable technologies for extracting CO2 from the atmosphere. Insulating houses is good for the economy, but it's also good for the environment. So those would be examples of activities that fit into bucket A. The second bucket, bucket B, is the could be good bucket. Those are things we really need to do. We want to do them, but we maybe don't want to do them the way we're doing them right now because they are harming the environment. So examples would be agriculture. We absolutely want to eat in the future. We want to be able to feed the population. But agriculture, in fact, it produces not CO2, but it's a serious producer of greenhouse gases. Public transport, we want to have a lot of public transport, but maybe we don't want to power it by burning fossil fuels. And energy generation. So those sorts of things would be in that could be good bucket, in bucket B. And then the bucket C is the bad bucket. Those are activities where actually in an ideal world, we wouldn't be doing them at all. And for example, burning fossil fuels would sit there. So once we know what sits in each of those buckets, we can think about a strategy that says we will grow that good bucket quickly, we'll transform everything in the second bucket, and we will shrink the third bucket, the bad bucket, as fast as we can. And when we look at the UK economy that way, this is how the picture looks. So on the x-axis, we've got the cumulative contribution to GDP of each of those sectors. And on the y-axis, we've got the cumulative contribution to CO2 equivalent emissions. And it's actually really good news, because what you can see is that something like 80% of the UK's GDP is already in the good bucket. It only needs very minor transformation. And most of the rest is in the could be good bucket. Really, the only thing that's in the bad bucket that should be aggressively shrunk is the burning of fossil fuels. So the structure of the UK economy is extremely helpful for us to be able to think about combining economic growth with minimizing environmental damage. If we can target investment at growing the good bucket and transforming the could be good bucket while we shrink the bad bucket, we can both produce economic growth and reduce emissions, and that would clearly be good for the environment. But what about people? How would we end mass impoverishment by doing that? Well, that brings us back to the question of thinking about the pie, how we can grow it, how can we share it more fairly. And policy formulation, of course, is a very complex issue. Every policy you think of has side effects that you don't like. But fundamentally, there are only 4 types of policy. So every policy either grows the pie or it doesn't, and it either shares it fairly or it doesn't. So that gives us a picture that looks a bit like this, where at the top right, we've got shared growth policies, which both grow the pie and share it fairly. So, for example, fundamental research, something that as a country we've been underinvesting in, gradually funding less and less of that, even though it's an engine of our future prosperity, or education or healthcare or civil infrastructure. All of those sorts of things help everybody in society. They are good for the pie. They're also good for sharing the pie fairly. So we want to see a lot more of those type 2 policies. At the top left, we've got policies which do grow the pie, but they don't share the benefits fairly. So an example would be very aggressive automation. That could be good for the economy because it would enable us to produce more valuable goods and services, and that could be good for society as a whole, but it could also lead to very many job losses and serious pain felt by the casualties of that if we do nothing to balance the policies. So with a captured growth policy, the pie can grow, but many people will find their slice shrinking dramatically. And that's what brings us to the need for those type 4 policies on the bottom right, which you can use them to balance the type 1 policies. So if we did have very aggressive job automation, some of the casualties could be mitigated by retraining and by direct job creation schemes. And some of the balancing would need to come from a strengthening of the safety net. So a good policy portfolio is a balanced policy portfolio. It's no good just having a type 1 policy if you don't have a type 4 policy to combine with it. And finally, we've got the type 3 policies in the bottom left, which are policies that don't grow the pie and they share it unfairly. So a no-deal Brexit would be an example of that. The government's own analysis of the impact of a no-deal Brexit shows that it would be expected to shrink the pie quite significantly. So if you do that, if you shrink the pie, of course, somebody's slice has to shrink. And actually, what will probably happen is that it won't be the hedge fund managers who have shorted various parts of the British economy who suffer. It will be a lot of normal people in Britain who suffer. So that is a really good example of a vulture policy. And in an ideal world, we would have a lot more shared growth policies, and we would basically eradicate the vulture policies. If we look back over the last 10 years, we can see that the main reason for a lot of our problems is that we've had a preponderance of those type 1 and type 3 policies, the captured growth policies and vulture policies, and we've had far too few type 2 and type 4 policies, far too few shared growth policies and balancing policies. So what would happen if we did make that shift? We shifted from type 1 and type 3 to a mix that was much, much heavier in type 2 and type 4. Well, effectively, it wouldn't create utopia, but it would get us back to that healthy kind of growth in median income that would produce an attractive world along the lines of what we talked about in part one, where the next generation has a reasonable expectation of being better off than today, and children have a reasonable expectation of being better off than their parents. And this is something that people always used to take for granted. My parents took it for granted that they would be better off than my grandparents. And they were right. They had more opportunities and they became better off. When I was young, I took it for granted that I would have more opportunities than my parents. And that was also true. And when my children were born, I still, at that point, took it for granted that they would have more opportunities than I had. What I see now is that unless we change direction, that won't be the case. So we need to make that choice, and we need to create that attractive future. And that sounds very difficult, but perhaps surprisingly, given the scale of the problem, the actions that we need to take are not individually either particularly radical or terribly complex. In fact, there are only 5 actions that we need to take. The first action is a democratic reset. So at the moment, we don't have a written constitution. And as a result, there's nothing in practice that prevents the government from enacting a policy that it knows will be harmful for 99% of the population. We've always just taken it for granted that no government would ever do that. But the last 10 years has shown us, and in particular, I think the last 1 year, that we really can't rely on taking it for granted. We need constitutional protection. And we also need far more in the way of checks and balances than are currently present. If you look at the state of the US today, you can see how fragile democracy is. And again, the last few months here have shown us that we also need to be very worried about that. So a democratic reset is a very important foundation. The second action, I think, is self-evident, which is we need to base policy making on fact, not myth. And that sounds completely obvious. But the truth is, the dominant policy, the most important policy of the last decade, has been austerity. And austerity was justified on the basis of what we've seen to be a myth, this point about the state of government finances being parlous and needing to be tackled immediately. That was a myth. And yet that drove austerity, and austerity has driven mass impoverishment. It's driven failing public services. It's driven a wide variety of issues that we now face today. So we need to get back to fact-based policy. Step 3 is what we've just been talking about, how to grow the pie and share it fairly with that portfolio way of thinking about policy making. And the 4th action, in a way, follows from that, which is to invest wisely in the future. Because of austerity, we've been unwisely underinvesting to a serious degree over at least the last 10 years, but to some extent a little bit before that as well. So there's an enormous amount of catching up to be done to invest wisely in the future. And finally, the 5th action is what we call ensuring clean, competitive markets. And the idea of that is to make sure that ethical businesses will always outcompete unethical businesses rather than the other way around. So I think there's a kind of conventional narrative about how business works, which is that if you treat your customers well, they'll be more loyal. If you treat your employees fairly, they will more than repay that with commitment and creativity. If you contribute to the rest of society, you'll be rewarded as a good corporate citizen. So in that story, ethical behavior and competitive advantage are more or less synonymous. And there have been quite a few initiatives, both in history and indeed quite recently, based on that theory. In the UK, Julian Richer and the CBI combined to launch a Good Business Charter. In the US, the Business Roundtable last year, I think, persuaded 181 CEOs to sign a pledge, which was redefining the purpose of the corporation from shareholder value maximization to stakeholder value maximization. And in both the US and the UK, B corporations are a kind of certification of ethical practice. And there's some good sense in that. And there are some good examples of companies which have both behaved ethically and been successful. not least Julian Rich's own company, Richer Sounds. Apparently, the top 10 in the UK include Pucker Teas, Neal's Yard, Triodos Bank, and Ecova. But if we look at the really successful companies, what do we see? Well, at the moment in the US, 5 very large companies make up 20% of the market value of the entire S&P 500. That's Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. Now, all of those companies are under investigation for anti-competitive behavior. They all avoid taxes. Amazon is notorious for its treatment of its workers, and Facebook has been complicit in abuses of democracy. They're America's 5 most successful companies, but are they the 5 most ethical companies in America? Well, I sincerely hope not. So what's really happening here? Well, in practice, one of the easiest ways for a business to become more competitive is to externalize its costs. If it can get the rest of society to pick up the tab for costs which are properly a cost of its own business, then it creates a cost advantage. So if it can pollute without paying the cost of the cleanup, if it can avoid its taxes, if it can underpay its staff and leave the rest of society to pick up the bill for all of that, it becomes much more profitable than an ethical one. And so the ethical businesses find themselves at a disadvantage. Amazon, I think, exemplifies the power of externalization as a competitive weapon. So at the moment, the playing field is actually tilted against ethical businesses. So the obvious way that a business can help to tackle all these issues is by behaving ethically. The less obvious one, but I think increasingly important, is by helping to change the system to level the playing field. So we actually have a project which we started a couple of months ago jointly with Imperial College and the Institute for Public Policy Research and the Impact Project, which is a project which coordinates the international accounting standard setters. And that project is aimed at quantifying those externalities, the costs that the businesses pass to the rest of society, and adjusting their accounts accordingly. It's the first step in a long journey towards re-engineering the profit motive into a force for good. So those are the 5 key actions. So to summarize, in the first part, we saw that the UK faces a choice, a stark choice, but nevertheless it is a choice. We can choose the shape of the future that we move towards and the kind of world that we leave to coming generations. And in the second part, we have just been talking about the kinds of policy shift and mindset shift that would be needed to move us towards that more attractive future. So at the same time that this book 99% was published just over a year ago, we set up the 99% organization. I hope I've given you a flavor for what we're trying to do with both the book and the movement. We're trying to end mass impoverishment, trying to create a world which is fit for younger generations, which will be greener, fairer, and more prosperous than today. So thank you very much indeed. Please do sign up and join us. The website link is there at the bottom. We need your help. The movement is entirely voluntary. There are about 700 members today, and all the projects we're doing, we can only do because of those volunteer members. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. We've about 10 minutes for questions, a little bit less. So I have a quick question here for you. How in practice are you planning to drive these changes yourself at 99%? Just to give us a bit more information on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, we set up the organization about a year ago, and what we are aiming to do is to build towards a position where we can shape policy in the UK. So that means actually there are only 650 people whose minds we need to change, who are our elected representatives in the House of Commons. If we can get enough of them understanding what I've been saying and determined to make the changes, then the change will happen. But of course, that's easier said than done. So we're building up a membership, and ideally, in a few years' time, we will have a sufficient membership that in most constituencies in the UK, we're in position to have a productive dialogue and indeed, if necessary, apply real pressure to MPs and candidates to make sure they change their policy. But we recognise that people can't do that on their own. So we're in the process of creating pressure points, as we call them, which enable them, give them the ammunition to have that kind of dialogue. So the book in itself is a pressure point, and the sorts of articles that we have on the website, which contain analysis of topical issues. In many cases, people then write to their MPs about the issues we've raised. That's a pressure point. The project that I mentioned that we are doing jointly with Imperial will create a pressure point in long term, but that is long term, unfortunately. We're aiming actually to see accounting standards changed, but in the short term, we're hoping to be able to publish league tables that enable consumers to see which businesses are contributing to society and which businesses are essentially parasitic on society, and that will apply pressure to those unethical businesses, and it will be a boon to the more ethical businesses. We have a sort of local action project which is supporting people in each constituency to gain publicity in their own areas and also to interact with their MPs. Many people are not comfortable writing to their MP. They've never done it. They don't quite know how to do it. They don't know what sorts of responses to expect. When they do it, they probably will get a standard letter back from the MP, and so they don't know what to do with that standard response. So that local action project helps people to feel their way through that unfamiliar process of talking to MPs. We're also talking to several of the all-party parliamentary groups. So at the moment, we've got good contact with the Future Generations all-party group and with the Longevity group, and we're looking to make contact with other groups.
It might be interesting to ask you a question here, Mark, because
yes.
someone asked that question to say, are there any of the current UK political aligned to this way of thinking, or just follow on more on your experience with parties or MPs in that, because you just started that, but there's a question here that got the most ranked so far.
Okay. I think what we're talking about actually appeals quite a long way across the political spectrum. If you're very, very hard left, you don't like what I've said because you want to see capitalism overthrown, and so you think I'm talking about something that's not sufficiently radical. And if you're very, very hard right, you don't like it because you think, well, mass impoverishment is the right outcome. Unfortunately, most people don't have a high enough market value, and they don't deserve to be able to access healthcare, or they don't deserve to have a decent house to live in. But in the middle, I think all the way from the middle of the Labour Party up to the One Nation Tories are people who would agree that the outcomes that I've been describing are attractive outcomes, and that's one of the reasons why we are talking with the all-party groups, because we don't want to be aligned with one particular party. Ideally, we would like all parties to say, yes, these are the right ideas. We're just the party that happens to be most competent at implementing them. We're a long way from that, but that's where we're aiming to get to. I would say so far that the two parties that have shown greatest interest have been the Labour Party and the Green Party. But we are open to talking to people from any party.
Interesting. There was a question there, but the person seems to have taken it off. Is what's the one thing we could all do? The question's just been removed. What's the one thing we can all do tomorrow to make a difference, and one thing in the long term? Sorry, I misread that. So what actually, one thing can
the simplest thing I think to do is to join the organisation. It takes literally 30 seconds. It costs 0 pence. and it doesn't really commit you to anything. So we have, as I said, we've got about 700 members, and what they actually choose to do varies quite widely. So we've got quite a number of people. All they want to do is to get the newsletters. So we send out a weekly newsletter, and each one has at least one piece of analysis, and it also has news about meetings, events like this, for example. It tells people about them so they can come along. So for a significant proportion of the 700, that's all they want. They just want to get the newsletters, and it keeps them up to date. It gives them some facts and figures they didn't have before, and they like that. There's a larger group who want the newsletter, but they haven't really got time to be very actively involved, but they do want to help. And the only way they can realistically help, given their time pressure, is by talking to people. So they talk to their friends and their colleagues, and they get their friends to read the book and that sort of thing. And that doesn't sound very helpful, but actually that is extremely helpful to us, because even if that person doesn't have time, one of those friends or colleagues might have a lot of time. And we've several times found that somebody who's in that second category does something just by talking to somebody. For example, arranging a session like this might be the kind of thing that somebody in that second category does. They haven't really got time, but they happen to talk to somebody like you, Jack, who is looking for a speaker, and they say, well, I know actually who you should get. And that's their contribution for the year. But that's a big contribution, actually. So then you've got, so those are the first two categories. Then you've got a smaller groups who have got time really to get plugged into these projects. I haven't talked about all of the projects yet, but some of them take more time and effort, and some people can, just spend a couple of hours a week on the project, and a much smaller number can spend many hours a week. So we have probably, out of the 700, we probably have only about a dozen who spend a great deal of time, but we have probably about 50 or 60 who spend quite a bit of time, and therefore they get involved in the projects. So if you sign up, then you have a menu of ways that you can get involved and help, ranging from tiny little things that are very easy to do to much bigger things that take a much greater commitment, but hopefully in the long run will be what drives the changes.
Another question from Andrea: is there real evidence in history that automation was bad for income distribution?
Well, it's a very good question. If you look at the Industrial Revolution, as I mentioned, it really took off around 1820. And if you look at average wages in the 35 years after that, they basically flattened out, and then they started to take off again. So the answer is not exactly yes, and it's not exactly no, because we're all much, much better off today than we would be if the Industrial Revolution hadn't happened. On the other hand, a whole generation saw their wages completely flattened by the Industrial Revolution. So it's a kind of yes and no answer.
I have just one quick question before I hand it back to Erin to close this down, Mark. And again, thank you for this. In your previous talk, I found your debt slide just so impactful.
Yes.
And again today, it just kind of why firstly don't we see that slide going back from the 1970s back to the 1700s? Why is that? That's my first question. And then, what did?
Very, very good question.
No, go ahead, Jacob.
So it's available. If you wanted to find it on the Bank of England website, it would probably take you, even without me telling you where to look, it would probably take you less than 20 minutes to find it. So any enterprising journalist could find this very, very, very easily. I've only seen one journalist do that, who is Martin Wolf from the Financial Times, who did print that graph in one of his columns quite a few years ago. Obviously, it was not completely up to date, but there's 300 years back to then. It was probably about 2009, 2010. He wrote about it. That's the only one that I've personally seen. And I find it extraordinary, given how important that graph is, that I've only seen it once in a newspaper. I interrupted your second question, Jack.
And just Danny, before we tie it up, any advice or any kind of what previous large debts? If I remember the graph, it was after Napoleonic Wars, and obviously it was after World War II.
Yes.
What did those governments do to bring down that debt, or just a couple of points on that?
There's actually an article on our website which looks into that in some detail. The article is called Debt Hysteria, and the last chart in that article precisely answers that question. So over the last 300 years, there has only been one thing that governments have been able to do that reduces debt to GDP, and that one thing is have significant growth in the economy. Without growth, we have never reduced debt to GDP. And again, nobody ever says that.
Look, Mark, I really want to thank you for your time. You're an engaging chap, full of information. You could probably talk for another 30, 40 minutes, but we're going to have to bring this to a close. So I want to thank you on my behalf and for the MBA students that attended for such an information and such a diverse view that we sometimes don't hear in media. But I think I'll hand it over to Erin to bring this to a close.
Thank you.
Mark, I want to thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And I also, I just want to echo what Jack said. Huge thank you for such an engaging presentation. Jack, if you're still there, could you possibly type Mark's website into the chat just so people can grab it before we all sign off? I also just want to take a second to echo Francisco's comments about alumni support. We have seen a huge increase in alumni supporting our volunteer initiatives, particularly our students. And I just want to say thank you for that. We really appreciate it. It's been a challenging few months for everyone. And also, if you do have any ideas for these types of events or speakers you'd like to see us bring to you, please do get in touch with our team. We have a general email address that I'm sure will pop up in the chat any second. And you're always welcome to reach out to that or to myself directly or anyone on the team. So yeah, again, Mark, thank you so, so much. And Jack, thanks for bringing us all together. And to Hazel and the rest of my team, thanks for making this all look so wonderfully easy and getting this done so well. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.